Thank you very much, John. I'm glad you asked us such a simple, easy question. So I'll be able to answer it conclusively and decisively in a very short period of time. No, seriously, who manages international security? As we would say in French, tout le monde et donc personne. Everybody and nobody, and therefore nobody. One could have thought that after conflictual bipolarity during the Cold War, after the unipolar moment of the 90s, mitigated sometimes, mediated sometimes, and sometimes not by the UN Security Council, having witnessed the G20 moment in 2009, that somehow we would be moving towards a multipolar world, operating either as a new version of the concert of powers, mitigated or not by the UN, the authority of the UN Security Council, or a grosso modo West versus the rest type of order, since we tend to have a more or less post-Westphalian West and a neo-Westphalian rest. Those countries which have suffered from colonialism and imperialism tend to attach greater value to old-style sovereignty, if I can use that expression, than those who have been historically more fortunate do. Well, that's not the world we have. Ian Bremmer talks about the G0 world, and may be the case. But it's also important to wonder why this is. Why don't we have a concert of power as the emerging powers emerge, as China becomes more powerful, etc.? Well, you talked, John, about the diffusion of power, and I'm not going to expatiate on that. I think you have already done that. But it's also because of the nature of the challenges we have to face, which flow from globalization. The importance of cross-border challenges, global challenges, challenges which cannot be met by a system which would be of the 19th century concert of powers type of system. Now, there's good news and bad news flowing from that. The good news is that this is a world which is less conducive to classical hegemony. And indeed, you don't, I may be misquoting Roger Cohen, it may be somebody else, who said there are no William II's in this world for the time being. There's no William II running China or Brazil or India, etc. Looking, seeking a place in the sun, and before you know it, you're engaged in the Griff nach die Weltmacht, to use the German expression of 1914. And it's a world which is also not conducive to a Lenin with a global ideological political agenda. So a world without William II and without Lenin is actually not a bad place to be compared to what it was a century ago. Or shortly after, a bit less than a century ago. The bad news is that if hegemony is more difficult, disruption is much easier. This is a world in which, as we have seen, non-state actors, AQ Khan, Al-Qaeda, to take another AQ, religious groups, hackers, Snowdens, you name it, have the ability to disrupt the system. And indeed, in a system which is weakly polarized in terms of traditional Westphalian power, it is much easier for local or regional polarizations to have enormous disruptive power. And for example, we see this playing out in the Middle East, where it may well occur that the Sykes-Picot, the post-Sykes-Picot order flowing from the First World War will be destroyed within the next years. First point. Second point. The world is characterized by two dominant factors as far as I view them. One is, of course, that we have a weakening West. A West which is less capable and increasingly unwilling to play its traditional role. Once again, I don't need to go into any sort of detail here. We see it particular when it comes to the global commons. The global commons, space, maritime spaces, cyber, etc. The US, by virtue of its superpower status, was and remains to a large extent a key player. But not only is it weakening intrinsically because of the rise of the emerging powers, but also because it has chosen to be semi-detached or sometimes fully detached from any form of multilateral approach to the management of the global commons, the ability for the US to ensure global security as a public service, I can put it that way, through the global commons is weakening rapidly. When I say semi-detached, the US has not ratified UNCLOS. The US in cyberspace, well, views cyberspace, I was going to make a very mauvais jeu de mots, through the prism of NSA. And I think those are actually the right words. In outer space, the US has been tending to look at space dominance rather than at prevention of the arms race in outer space and so on. So the weakening West, and this is also true vis-à-vis the disorders of globalization in general. But, and this is the companion point, is that the emerging powers also need functioning global commons. They also need to see the disorders of globalization being managed, whether it's epidemics, whether it's dealing with failed states, like post-NATO Afghanistan. What Karl Eikenberry told us this morning applies not only to Western intervention, it would apply to any intervention. So how do you handle that? So the challenge number one is, how does one deal with the weakening West? But challenge number two is, how are the emerging powers going to deal with the vacuum or the semi-vacuum? And this is, this is, I think, to me, the biggest challenge. Three bottom lines, very briefly. An admonition, a warning, and a caveat. The admonition is that the West will have to learn to operate in an environment which is more Westphalian than the West itself would tend to want it to be. It is going to have to operate with partners from the emerging countries which have a vision of the world which is much more classical than our own, and this is true of the great democracies of the South, not only of a country like China. And of course, the emerging powers will have to learn how to water down their own Westphalian vision if they want to be able to meet the challenges of cross-border, climate change, epidemics, all of these issues which cannot be handled purely by Westphalian or neo-Westphalian system. The warning: power contests are not going to disappear. William II's will re-emerge in a different way, in a different setting. And states, of course, will remain the only full-spectrum actors, even if they are challenged in many of the things they do in various segments of the spectrum that they cover, but they only cover, of course, that spectrum within their own borders. So when I say that there are no William II's and no Lenins, that may be partially a contingent situation. And lastly, the caveat: the West is not going to disappear. Like others, I worry about declining defense budgets, etc. I'm well placed, unfortunately, to know how difficult it can be. But of course, defense is being transformed by the forces of globalization, and notably by the revolution in information technology and communication. This is Moore's law at work, and these are areas in which the West retains a very, very strong comparative advantage. So yes, a weakening West, certainly a much less willing West, but it's a West which will remain in many ways still a pace setter, however powerful China may become in relationship to the US.